Hello and welcome to PGurus channel. I'm your host Sri Iyer. Today I have the pleasure of company of Pandit Satish Kumar Sharma ji from United Kingdom. Satish Kumar Sharma ji, welcome to PGurus channel.
Pralam ji, Iyer ji, it's a pleasure to be here after what seems like a long time, but so much has been happening. So I think we're looking forward to having a really good conversation this evening.
And yes, indeed. And Pandit ji, I wanted to tell you that I always have a lot of fun doing these hangouts with you and viewers. You don't want to miss any of today's hangout. We have 6 major issues to talk about, and there's a big reveal coming at the very end. And I would like each and every one of you to stay for that. And do not forget to subscribe to PGurus channel. And if you can find it in your heart to donate to us, please do so. The data comes at the end of the video. And I really, really thank you from the bottom of my heart, because everybody's going through some tough times. We are trying to bring you quality programming, in-depth conversations, very out-of-box thinking on some of the topics. So you know that PGurus stands committed to excellence in journalism. Thank you very much for that spiel. So Panditji, take it away. So today is Shankaracharya Jayanti. And, not only did he establish 4 mathas, he also did a lot more. Perhaps you could share your understanding of the work that Adi Shankara did in his very short span, I think of 30 plus years.
That's right. It's conventional practice for us to recognize our gurus whenever we start something. And I think on today of all days, it would be beholden upon me to ask everyone just to mentally say Om Guru Bhyo Namaha. And we are so indebted to Adi Shankaracharya ji, as he's known. Not only did he establish the mathas that you've mentioned, but he also systematized a lot of the approaches towards puja, towards our rituals that we engage in, that preserve many of the spiritual secrets. And one of the greatest gifts that he gave us was he put the whole Advaita Vedanta philosophies into a context which was much more approachable by many, many people.
So, Satish ji, the last time we spoke about the asymmetrically high number of coronavirus instances in the British Indian population of 80 plus, and the imminent danger that this particular virus could essentially wipe out that complete demographic. And this was something that we had expressed some grave concerns. And, has there been any action on part of the government and also the community itself? I think we suggested a few things, saying that if you have to run errands, don't let the older generation to run the errands, let the younger, more fitter generation to go and do the thing, and so on and so forth. How has the reaction been?
You're absolutely right. Some 4 or 5 weeks ago, when we released that last video, I shared some evidence that I had received from medical practitioners, which was indicating that there was a spike. And in fact, PGurus was the first to make this disclosure. As a result of some of the comments that we had made, I understand that even the PGurus video was widely circulated amongst policymakers to make them aware of this issue. Now, since that time, a great deal of research has been done. Some academics from our own community, from the community in Leicester, many people have been exploring this issue, and it's confirmed that there is a disproportionately high number of casualties amongst our community. Now, one thing we were trying to get hold of was to actually know the number of deaths by ethnicity. With something like this pandemic, it's obvious that social behavior contributes towards the spread of this virus. And so wouldn't it be a wonderful piece of information, a very valuable piece of data, if we could identify if there were particular social trends or habits or customs which would contribute towards the virus spreading faster than it needed to be. So the data I was after was to know the number of deaths per ethnicity, so that we could start to drill down and determine if there were actions that could be taken. You'd be stunned and surprised to know that there is no data held on ethnicity when it comes to a death. So we're unable to say whether it is Asians, whether it's Pakistanis, whether it's Indians, whether it's Hindus, Muslims, Jehovah's Witnesses, or whatever. At this moment in time, we're not able to drill down into the data and see which communities seem to be spiking. So that's a huge, glaringly obvious omission. And I know that a lot of people are now clamoring, pressing the government to try and get it to do something to establish what the analysis is there. The issue has raised a number of other interesting points. In Britain, there has always been a sense that there is a degree of white supremacy, and that the institutions, what's called the establishment, they have a great deal of difficulty with trying to maintain equality in this area. I'm reminded of something Will Durant, a long time ago, when he observed the British. He said, I like and honour Englishmen, but I'm not fond of the British. The English are the best of gentlemen on earth, but the British are the worst of all imperialists. So he drew a distinction between the Englishman and the Brit. And it's actually the Brit who has the problem with these issues. And so what we wanted to do is we've kept an eye on how that racism or that discrimination, that supremacist attitude begins to disclose itself in times of crisis. And we have been surprised to find that in the NHS, where there have been many cases of Indian origin doctors challenging the NHS on grounds of discrimination, we've been troubled to find that 44% of the NHS medical staff, they're actually comprised of members of the BAME community, whereas the number of deaths due to COVID is 72%. Now, why on earth is it that 72% of people from the Black minority ethnic community are actually dying against a population background where they're less than half? Is it the manner in which people are being deployed? Is it the degree of exposure? Are we having more members of our community right on the front line? Unnecessarily high proportions. But there is such an aberration there that is worth exploring. And so we are trying to dig down a little bit deeper to find out what's going on there. As far as I understand, we've had 492 Indian origin people have died due to COVID so far in this country. And even that figure, if you work out a proportion in terms of the population, is actually double the standard that one would expect. One would expect it to be in the region of about 200, 250, and yet it's double. So there are some issues that are now coming out which people are beginning to ask questions about. This whole COVID thing, it's brought a number of other questions to the fore. One thing that we have always noticed in this country is that the decision-making, the power of allocating budgets and determining policy, very rarely has that actually been placed in the hands of people from the BAME community. So we will have a great number of our community members at tier 2 positions, but never at tier 1 positions, especially in the old British establishments. Now, you will know that the cabinet is obviously totally different, in that Boris Johnson, Prime Minister Johnson, who has returned to work today and is looking much, much better than he was only a few weeks ago. So he has surrounded himself with people on the basis of competency, whether they can do the job, whether they're qualified to do it, and that choice is beginning to really bear fruit. But apart from Boris Johnson's cabinet, the majority of the civil service is still very, very much neo-colonialist in its way of thinking. And we're watching to see that all of the experts who have been wheeled out day in, day out, they're all comprised of middle-aged white men. And we know that there are a lot of experts amongst other communities in this country as well. So I was having a conversation with a colleague that the head of the British Medical Association, the chair of the British Medical Association, is an Indian gentleman, Dr. Nagpal. And we were just thinking that if he was inspired to get in touch with the emergency committees and say, look, you know, I run this organization, we represent all of the doctors in the country, we have access to communications networks and resources, and perhaps we can offer a bit of expertise, the chances are that the response he would get from some of the not so not so equal-minded, fair-minded, pale, male, and stale, I believe, is the description that some people are labeling these guys with, would probably be, no, thank you, sir, we have enough experts. You know, it's that sort of thing. But it's been noticed that in many countries, the experts who are being put in front of cameras and who are leading policy-making decisions, many of them include BAME representatives. And yet in England, time and time again, where we have such a large number of doctors, we have such a large number of scientists and experts, we don't seem to be seeing them on the front ranks. So this COVID thing has raised a lot of questions. It's brought some cracks have begun to appear in otherwise well-covered facades. We're monitoring that, and we will see what happens.
Well, now that you mentioned the doctors, 1 in 7 doctors in the United States is of Indian American origin. And it's a very high number, and they're also very highly rated. Let's move back to United Kingdom. Good to see Bojo find some of his mojo. I'm sorry, I just cannot.
You love that, don't you?
I just cannot resist, especially when I imagine if Sir Humphrey were to work for him, he would be cringing every 2 seconds.
No, it's great to see him back. And, you know, we were just talking about discrimination. It's almost tangible when he takes the stage and speaks surrounded by members such as the Chancellor of the Exchequer and Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, that he genuinely has no consciousness of their identity as being ethnic minorities. You know, he completely speaks to them as equals. But I do wonder sometimes what the dynamics are like around the cabinet table. I'm sure that there are civil servants who probably don't even engage eye to eye with members of our community. You know, they're still uncomfortable that, hang on, these people are sitting at this table. I would really love to be a fly on the wall in the Cabinet Office just to see that one dynamic, you know, whether people are actually treating Home Secretary Priti Patel genuinely as equals, or whether they're still stumbling with that old British colonial stiff upper lip and discomfort. It'll be great to read their memoirs, Rishi Sunak's and Priti Patel's memoirs one day, and then we'll find out the truth.
Panditji, you can do it today. If you can open all the body chakras in your body, and your Atma can go and do sanchar, and you can be a fly on the wall if you want to.
If that was the case, that would be the last place I would want to wander around. But it's I'm sure there'll be chuckles, and it'd be interesting to know whether this is genuinely progress that we're making, or whether people are still playing those silly little games. I'm sure that you've experienced them. I've encountered them in one sitting in a boardroom, and you know straight away when a person across is very uncomfortable with you because of your identity or perhaps your ancestry. Right. You can pick it up straight away, and so it'd be very interesting to see.
Speaking of mojo, how are things at the Labour Party these days?
Yes, mojo. It seems that the mojo is slowly reappearing. When we last spoke, I seem to recall mentioning that Kier Starmer was the favourite and the front runner, and we hoped that Lisa Nandy would be somewhere in the running as well. And as we had expected, Kier Starmer has taken the mantle. He is the leader of the Labour Party now.
Was there an election, sir?
There was elections. He came, I think he was a clear winner, and then Lisa Nandy was the next sort of runner-up. Okay. So she is now, if I recall, she is now the shadow foreign secretary. So she's been given the chance to engage on an international platform. It's some of the cynics in our community are saying, well, it's a good political move because her constituency is a very loyal constituency. She's done very good work with them. They're solidly behind her. And perhaps sending her off to the former colonies and getting her out onto the international stage could help secure Kier Starmer's sense of safety even more. But no, it's good that the leadership contest has finished. Having said that, you may recall that we had some reservations about Kier Starmer's past, and especially about whether he'd be engaging with our community on the basis of respect, courtesy, and inclusion. We've seen some indications that perhaps not all is happening as we would have liked it to happen.
Well, wasn't Kier Starmer the Director General of the Crown Prosecution Services when the rape grooming case was being handled by the CPS?
Yes, it wasn't. It'll go down in history as not being his best moment. His judgment was, with the wisdom of hindsight, very, very seriously questioned now. I recall after the evidence had been presented to him, to the CPS, the decision was made not to proceed with the prosecutions. And that was a very, very unpopular decision. And once the results really started to cascade through and we saw the scale of this particular problem, he then made an announcement. I think he said a generation of girls was betrayed by the justice system's flawed approach to this particular issue. That's just too small a sentence to just completely close off the chapter. And even to this day, many of those girls who were abused and who suffered, many of them are making the statement that nothing has changed. That if anything, it's as bad as it always was, and it may even be worse. So that wasn't his greatest hour by any means, hugely disappointing. When he took the reins, the first thing he did was apologize to the Jewish community for the anti-Semitism issue, the problem that the Labour Party has with anti-Semitism. But he made no remarks at all to acknowledge some of the unpleasant exchanges that had occurred between his parliamentarians on the Labour Party and the Hindu community, and indeed some of the wholly unjustified decisions and policies they had tried to impose upon us, which was a bit of a disappointment. So no apology to either India and the Indian government for the nonsense that was spouted at their conferences. Certainly no recognition to the Hindu community that the Labour Party has a genuine Hindu-odic problem. There is almost an institutionalized contempt for Indians and the Hindu community, and we're hoping that he would do something on that. But so far, nothing at all. It'll be interesting to see whether he is just making the right noises to a potential vote bank that they are risking losing, or whether he genuinely does have concern for the British Hindu community as British citizens. The verdict has yet to come in.
You know, anyone aspiring for prime ministership should learn to carry everyone along. And I think now was an excellent time for him to do the damage control. You know, historically, British Indians have considered themselves pro-labor because of their perception that it was a Labour Party that got them the independence. Of course, a lot of people left out the small print, which was that the Labour Party also presided on the partitioning of India and Pakistan. And those problems still are raw, those wounds are still fresh. And any rate, this would have been a very good time for him to mend the fences, so to speak, and open a new chapter in the book. But let's wait and see. I mean, it's still early days. You never know.
Well, and the opportunities have come thick and fast, and none of them have been taken up by his office. In fact, only on Friday of last week, he convened a meeting specifically within the Labour Party with one purpose in mind, and that was to review the issue to do with COVID casualties amongst the BAME communities. And so this was convened, and members of the Jewish community, the Muslim community, Black organizations, and indeed a Sikh organization were all invited. But the Hindu community was completely overlooked. Completely overlooked. Either overlooked, and that was incompetence, or perhaps it's something more unpleasant. But it did rankle amongst the community that here is a new leader of the Labour Party, and he's picking up the reins and carrying on from where the old leader left out. So far, no positive signs. We are actually quite skeptical, to be perfectly honest. The community is quite skeptical. We know, if I give you a very tangible and real example, Dr. Ambedkar spent many years here in London, and the house in which he lived is acknowledged as a place of heritage and of worth. And there's one of those little blue plaques there. You may recall Modiji visited the museum not so long ago.
Yes.
Well, prior to Modiji's visit, there was a bit of a hoo-ha. The Camden Council Planning Department had withdrawn permission and said, right, we are not going to let this building be a museum, and Dr. Ambedkar is not a person of any great significance. we don't believe, and so it should just revert back to a normal residential residence. Now, this is Camden, and Camden is known to be a very posh, sort of wealthy area, but it's also a staunch Labour stronghold. And so the notion that the Labour Council were actually passing a decision which would prevent Dr. Ambedkar, who is one of the leading icons in the Dalit movement and the civil rights movement for people who are discriminated against, the notion that a Labour Council would say that Dr. Ambedkar is of no international significance and so we can just convert this house to a normal residence, it goes against the normal Labour PR that we just absolutely support the oppressed and the underdog and the downtrodden. And a few of my friends have noticed that many of the Labour millionaires, they all live in Camden Council, and that area is very posh. And perhaps the last thing they wanted was a continuous steady stream of dark-skinned Indian folk traipsing through their posh streets, visiting Dr. Ambedkar's shrine. But to top it all, guess who the Member of Parliament is for Camden Town?
I'm going to take a wild guess here. Is it Kier Starmer?
It is Kier Starmer. You're absolutely right. So, it's so much for the, we are the party who supports the Dalit community. It's a nonsense. It's more champagne socialism.
I'm going to stick my neck out and say that he's going to do a 180-degree turnaround come next elections. So we shall wait and see.
Oh yes, he will rediscover his supporting the Earth's destitute and downtrodden credentials probably about 2 months before the elections. But I'm fairly confident that the British Indian community, British Hindu community, are becoming a little bit more organised now, and we are going to be a lot more direct and clear in our engagement with parliamentarians. I see so many signs of that happening, which is a great development and long overdue.
Yes, yes. And I think in a small part, we can claim credit for doing this. Most of it goes to you, Panditji, because you are the one, you're on the ground. All I'm doing is asking you a few questions and sitting back and relaxing while you give the answers, very well thought out as well as I might say. And I will say that. And I'm sure our viewers recognize the value you bring to our Hangouts. And again, thank you from the bottom of my heart for making this happen. Now, for the big reveal. Now, we have talked about this organization in the past, about its Hindi service being either truncated or closed down. I don't know exactly what the status is today, but that was an indication of things to come. Where are things these days with BBC?
The BBC, firstly, thank you for your very kind remarks a moment ago. I find myself in a situation where I can contribute, and with your support, my contribution is magnified and amplified many-fold. Otherwise, nobody would be hearing some of the news and the perspectives that we're able to share. So we're in this together, and I'm grateful to you and to Dr. Swami for the support and exposure that we get. Turning to this institution. Okay, so the BBC has a long and checkered history. British Broadcasting Corporation, that word British, and the sense that the British are the worst of all imperialists, as Will Durant said, is 100%. It's perfectly, it hits the nail on the head. So the BBC has been criticised repeatedly over the last decade by members of the British Indian community, and they shrug it off in the same way that the old British imperial establishment used to shrug things off as being, relatively unimportant. But a couple of things have happened recently which are very relevant. One is that because of the lockdown, the BBC convened a meeting, and in this meeting came to the conclusion that it would be a great thing for them to do to broadcast Muslim prayers, the azan and things of this sort, on national BBC radio stations, some 39 local radio stations up and down the country. And the announcement was made amidst a great deal of fanfare, until somebody sent in a Freedom of Information request and asked them at that meeting, was there any mention of any of the other minority communities who are also experiencing lockdown, and perhaps who, being license fee payers, have a right to expect to be represented as well? And as far as we can gather, a response hasn't yet been given to us, but as far as we can gather, the point wasn't even discussed. It didn't occur to anybody else. It didn't occur to anybody at all to say, well, we need to also do this for the rest of the community. Let's put a program together, and that would have been a wonderful thing. What seems to have happened afterwards is that a great deal of backpedaling is going on. So I had a lengthy conversation with some senior members at the BBC and shared with them some of our concerns. And one of the things that has emerged from it, which is possibly a good development, that is that they're allocating time on weekly broadcasts now for the British Indian community to offer reflections and a few words from our Shastra and perhaps a bit of guidance and support for the community. That's a good development. And having said that, we still want the response to the Freedom of Information request, and we'd like to correct the root cause of this difficulty. One of the other strange things is that the BBC continuously says it has no problem, that there are minor aberrations in all very large organizations, but this is not really the truth. They're being economical with the truth, I think, is the expression. We started to do some digging around, and you're aware that our Home Secretary, Priti Patel, she is of Indian origin, and there was a time when she was the Indian diaspora champion, and she established very close links with Prime Minister Modi, and has been a very strong voice supporting prosperity between the Indo-British connection. And so she too felt very strongly about some of the things the BBC had been doing. And so she wrote a letter to the BBC, and I've managed to get a copy of this letter, and it is scathing in terms of how it deals with the BBC's coverage of matters to do with India, to do with Indians, certainly to do with Prime Minister Modi. The letter refers to some of the coverage which was at the time of the Indian election, going as far back as 2014 for a moment. I don't know if you recall, but the BBC was dragging every Tom, Dick and Jagdish, and my apologies to all the Jagdishes out there, in front of a camera, completely unqualified people who had no credentials or credibility were being brought in front of the cameras with no discussion of policy, no discussion of issues of national economics or anything like that. The focus was time and time again denigrate and vilify Prime Minister Modi. And what Pritiji, the Home Secretary, had written refers to this extensively. And it is a scathing letter. It makes it absolutely clear that at the highest levels, there's a great deal of dissatisfaction with the way in which the BBC covers affairs of the British and minority ethnic communities. Now, we're going to pick up and build on this a little bit further.
Sure.
I've done a bit more research, and a while ago there was something established called the BBC Asian Network, and long-standing broadcasters of Indian origin had gotten together and put together a network which was providing all sorts of programming. There was news, there was music and everything else, and it was led and guided by a bunch of people who had Indian origin, darkies as the colonialists used to call us. At this moment in time, all of the decision makers are now actually from the pale, male and stale community, right across the board, which is...
Those initials mean something else in a different domain, but please go ahead.
Really? Pale, male and stale is one of the colloquialisms that the youngsters are using these days to refer to those anemic, middle-class, British civil servants who need to get out and expose themselves to the sun a little bit more. But they have uninspiring agendas and perhaps hearkening back to days of past glory more than dealing with current day issues.
Colonel Hathi.
Colonel Hathi, absolutely right. You're spot on. But those are they seem to be the guiding forces of the BBC at the moment. But we have opened some very robust channels of exchange, and I'll be sharing the letter that Home Secretary Priti Patel ji has written to the BBC in a more public space. And if you wish, I'll be happy to send you a copy of the letter that we've got.
Oh,
and
absolutely.
You can publish it on the website even.
Yes, and we intend to do just that. And viewers, as part of this video, there's going to be on PGurus website, the letter itself, and you'll be able to read what exactly was exchanged. And this is important because this is not something that is yesterday. It's been there for many, many years now. And at that time when she wrote it, probably was she in power at that time or not really?
She was very influential. She was the Indian diaspora champion,
Right.
And a person of significant influence with David Cameron's cabinet.
Was she a member of the cabinet at that time?
Not secretary level, no.
Right.
But she was the international development and trade minister at one point, I think.
Understood.
But you're absolutely right. It is very, very important. The BBC needs to be brought dragging and sort of kicking into the 21st century. Only last week, when we heard the tragic news of the murder of the two sadhus from Juna Akhada.
Yes.
When we heard news of that, it was horrific. And the BBC chose to report it as 2 Hindu godmen killed in mistaken identity as thieves or something like that. Now, they would never refer to members of any other religious group as godmen. Okay, you would not hear them referring to Christian pastors who perhaps had been killed as godmen. And it's that derogatory undertone which seems to permeate their coverage of anything to do with Hindus that we're going to address. And the more and more information we find out about what's happening with regard to that horrific and tragic incident, the more and more it seems that the BBC is dragging its heels on wanting to disclose the full facts.
Was this willful or was it ignorance on part of the person who wrote the copy?
So the BBC expends a great deal of effort in maintaining a reputation of editorial integrity, of quality of journalism and research. This is how it portrays itself. And in the past, when we've presented evidence and information to them for programming purposes, they've maintained a very high bar of quality of information. If I give you one example, there was only 2 years ago, myself as a representative of the Hindu community, Lord Singh representing the Sikh community. We had one gentleman who was representing the Pakistani Christian community. A group of us presented evidence to the BBC to say there is an issue, and that is that our minority community of vulnerable girls are also being attacked by the same demographic who you are now referring to as Asians, and you have never covered this story. In fact, we were telling you about this in the 1980s. And here's all the evidence. We gave them the evidence, cases, histories, names, witnesses, the whole shooting match, and they came back to us and said, well, the editors feel that the quality of evidence actually isn't quite sufficient for us to write a story or produce a documentary on this issue. This is despite the presence of people like Lord Singh and other very, very prominent people. And so the bar that they set for the quality of evidence seems to be very high when it comes to issues which are actually in our interests. But on the other hand, to publish something derogatory such as Hindu godmen killed, that is completely at the other end of the spectrum, in that it doesn't acknowledge the fact that they were sannyasis. Can you imagine if they'd written monks or something like that? It would have communicated a totally different message. And this is an organization with specialisms in communication. Every word is important, every nuance is important. And so we do not feel that this is incompetence. We do not feel this is a minor occasional lapse. There is enough evidence to indicate that this is something systemic, and we will be pursuing it with them.
So why this bigotry towards Sanatanis?
I think it's actually a hangover to the old colonial past. Remember, in the United Kingdom, the atrocities that were inflicted upon the Hindu population by Anglican colonialists, in what was British-occupied India, they're not taught here. Over in this country, in the United Kingdom, we have a population who genuinely believed the tales of the civilizing white man going out there and trying to bring reason and civilization to the savage. They actually have been, precisely, they've been taught that for so long, and it's actually become part of the consciousness and the psyche, an unconscious sense of superiority, especially when it comes to Indians and Hindus. No other community is subjected to the scrutiny and the denigration and the wanton contempt, as our community is, by the establishment institutions, and the BBC is, I'm afraid, at the forefront of it.
Well, I hope that sanity comes, and BBC is an extremely good organization, and their fall from the lofty perches is actually an opportunity for blog sites such as mine, PGurus, to shine here, and we are very, very conscious of the fact that we need to only report news that's factual, that is the truth. Otherwise, we'll suffer the same fate as BBC. Now, I have to always keep remembering myself. I mean, I check and double check and trust and make sure that it is verified, so that we don't willfully or wrongfully accuse someone of something that they did not do. So
I think one thing which is apparent and should be apparent to all of your audience is that there is no willful malintent.
Yes.
That there's no intention to unjustifiably diminish any person, community, or group in your broadcasts. They tend to be with an intention of actually doing good and contributing to the public debate in a positive manner, which is for the benefit of everybody. Sadly, the British institutions don't have that ethos as part of their culture. You may remember I mentioned once that only 2 or 3 months ago, the Archbishop of the Church of England, Justin Welby, made an announcement in which he said that the Anglican Church is deeply institutionally racist. And this is the institution that has been dictating the moral development and the guidance and the margdarshak, as it were, of the British English community. And if that institution is now openly having to admit that this is the case, it's not unreasonable to assume that its teachings have actually seeped into the thinking of many of the British institutions. And this is the reality that we're experiencing now. Hopefully we can start to contribute towards getting them beyond this psychological block.
And I also hope from the bottom of my heart, and we are going through some really difficult times. I mean, the whole world is going through this, and humanity needs to be respected. A fellow human being is just as equal to you in every aspect, and we all need to bear and find ways to dig deep, in fact, to try and get past this. And this problem shall pass too. There have been worse plagues in the past, so this will go. It is just that we need to think as a humanity, as a human race, and see how best we can help one another. Because I'm reminded of the famous saying, Manava Seva is Madhava Seva, meaning like service to humanity is service to God. And thank you very much, Panditji, for sharing your thoughts and bringing us up to date on the events happening in United Kingdom. And
My pleasure.
If there's anything else you would like to add before we sign off, please
yes,
go ahead.
Yes, on this COVID issue, we have actually got a huge contribution to make. Right? In our worldview, we are part of the world. We have this notion that Dharma is a jigsaw puzzle where all of the pieces fit together to make an incredibly beautiful picture. Whereas the Western tradition looks on the world almost as a hostile environment, where they have to fight and wage war in order to get what they want. And it's the difference between a consumption-driven community and society and another community which is here to do seva and to respect the earth and all of life.
Right.
So there are two different worldviews here, and I think what we're seeing is that the relatively recent civilizationally adolescent perspective that this planet exists for us to consume without responsibility is now beginning to feel the consequences. The karmic comeback is going to return to that. Our perspective is that there is enough for everyone's need, but the planet doesn't exist just to satiate all of our stimulation demands. And so we have a slightly different view, which I think makes us a little bit more resilient, especially in the Indian space, where, Yoga and Ayurveda, they teach that if your pran shakti is maintained at reasonable levels, then the environment can do nothing to you in this body. It's only when you start to do things that deprive the body of pran that all of a sudden you become vulnerable to the natural environment, which is permeated with all sorts of bugs and fungal spores and all sorts of things are out there. But when we start to do things such as consume beef burgers day in and day out, the body struggles to digest so much material. So pranashakti levels deplete. And there's so many other activities which some communities do, which weaken our own bodies. And the earth then says, okay, you've weakened yourselves. I'm afraid you now become vulnerable. And this is what happens. I suspect pandemics happen in a cyclical manner, that human society, the de facto way of living, becomes so unhealthy for a human being that suddenly we become vulnerable to assault by these little minions that are out there, these viruses. We learn our lessons, we change our habits, and then all of a sudden we find that our robust immune systems can actually deflect them. So everybody who is part of our ancient traditions on how to not only look after each other, but to look after our bodies and to look after the planet, needs to be sharing this knowledge and spreading this knowledge with confidence, because inside of this knowledge is the power to live and to thrive and prosper on this planet. And we call that Dharma.
Yes, indeed. And someday someone will probably release statistics about how many people who died of coronavirus were vegetarians. I'm very curious to know what that number is going to be. But
Absolutely.
thank you very much, Panditji. And we'll be back with more interesting information and news from United Kingdom very shortly. Thank you once again.
Pranamji and namaskar to all your viewers, and may everyone stay safe, and best wishes to all your families as well. Namaste.
Thank you, sir.